Hi, I'm Keith McPeters from Gustafson, Guthrie, Nichol. And Sue was right. If you have any problems with what I say, you can blame Sue Weiler because she hired me for my first job out of graduate school. So like everyone else, when I heard about this thing, Civic Horticulture, when Charles contacted us, I was very excited. Didn't really know that much about what the words meant either, but I thought I would go ahead then and try to establish my horticultural cred, street cred with you, because my wife's from Philadelphia, and she said, hey, PHS, they mean business. They're the real thing. So I grew up in Virginia, in the suburbs outside of Richmond, not like this anonymous child you see here. The soil in Virginia is there's a lot of red clay soil. It's the same color as my mother's hair. My mother loved planting azaleas, and she was always planting azaleas. I never really understood it because they were these kind of scraggly, kind of leggy-looking things. We planted them by the driveway, which wasn't so good. They never seemed to work. They were kind of just green, and I never understood, but she always talked about she loved azaleas. I went on, I was trained as an architect, worked for architecture in a while in New York City, then eventually trained as a landscape architect. But somewhere in my late 20s, early 30s, on a trip to Charleston, I saw azaleas and realized that azaleas are supposed to bloom. My mother's never bloomed, but she still loved them. I thought, God, that must be the power of horticulture right there. Fortunately, now I work with these people in Seattle, Gustafson, Guthrie, Nichol, founded by Catherine Gustafson, Jennifer Guthrie, and Shannon Nichol. We have an office in Seattle, and we have a small office that we just opened in Washington, D.C. I'm going to talk about 3 projects today, one in Cleveland, one in Chicago, and one in Nashville. Projects that, as we've worked on them, I realized they all sort of fell into the context of remnants of the City Beautiful movement. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I guess in Philadelphia, that would be pronounced City Beautiful. Daniel Burnham, who did some of he did the Wanamaker building here in Seattle, was architect out of Chicago. It's very brief. He did was sort of kicked off the City Beautiful. I think it's interesting because the City Beautiful movement in the turn of the 18th, 19th century was, 19th, 20th century, was kind of this first movement of like beautifying the city on this civic scale. And I think it's kind of interesting, some parallels to what we're looking at now with this kind of green and moving back to the city. The World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago was a big deal. It did 2 things. It set about, one, this idea of an architecture, kind of unified architecture, framing a space, carving out a space, a civic space in some of America's cities that were developing kind of helter-skelter and didn't have these kind of big civic spaces. The other thing it did, it started this tradition, or really amplified this tradition of kind of these expositions, which then, a lot of those expositions ended up being park grounds in our cities today in later years. Olmsted Sr. was also involved here, and he and Burnham had some arguments about discussions about landscape and what it should do, which might also be a precursor for some of the things we do today. This was known as the White City. The group plan in Cleveland. The group plan in Cleveland was after the 1893 Chicago White City. This was the first actual real city that Burnham got to build. Cleveland was a big inland port on Lake Erie. It shipped a lot of things. It was really industrial. Standard Oil was started there. It was kind of a real industrial kind of ramshackle kind of city. Very active. The idea was with this group plan that they would come in, and you can see the big opening they carved out in the middle. It's supposed to be the train station on the lake in the far distance there. You arrived through the train station. You walked in through this big civic space. Now, what's interesting is they actually got a lot of this right. They got all the buildings right, all the vertical walls they built, and those buildings are still there today. You see on the left the plan of 1903, what they were trying to do, and you see how it is in 2010. So some of the buildings, the courthouses, they're there, the 2 libraries, those were all built. They got the vertical walls right. What they seem to be arguing about almost from the time it was started all the way up until now, currently, is what happened on the ground plane. I think Olmsted Jr. and Burnham argued about it a little bit, and they're still arguing about it. Evolution of what's called the mall, the ground plane there is called the mall, although if you ask someone in Cleveland where the Cleveland Mall is, you will get completely different directions to this place. But So you see 1903 to 1936, they kind of filled it up with this exposition for a while. In the 1960s, they kind of had this grass panel with trees. Somewhere in the 1930s, they built a convention center underneath there. 1968, they kind of renovated that convention center and they replaced it all with kind of fountains and things. And what you saw in that earlier plan was they started to chop them all up in a lot of ways. When we came on as a project, what we did was they were building a new convention center, which was going to be, 6 feet higher than the current convention center, still underground, still on the same floor plan. It was going to get taller, but we had to make it shorter on the outside. So taller on the inside, shorter on the outside, so you could get to it. And a couple other things. It was going to be a design-build project. So what we tried to do, you see this concept sketch in the bottom, we said the main things we wanted to do in this project, what was called the baseline project for this, was try to get that grass lawn back, try to get this more pedestrian-oriented, and you see the promenades, the alleys of trees running the entire 3 blocks, like in the original 1903 rendering. We want to get at that connection back, that vertical element of trees. So we could do that in the design-build baseline. We could get grass, trees, we could get some concrete sidewalks, and we could get those alleys back, which was nice. That was the bones of the structure. We also got all the structure underground put in, so in the future, when they went back to put in other things, they would be able to do this, other plants and things. This is a plan of something, the current plan. You'll see the green lawn in the middle, which is skinnier now because it's framed, and the alleys are framed on both sides, with these other things around the edges. One of the ideas was to try to activate these edges with smaller scale gardens. The big grand scale they had of the lawn, the monumental scale, they had that working okay. What they didn't have, and which was not in the baseline project, was this other scale of that. So we looked at these things: alignment, promenade, scale, and garden. And I kind of like this idea that a promenade and garden are kind of nouns and verbs. What happened then, in the course of this project, the mayor said, hey, this is a great idea. We're going to appoint a new group plan. So they got a lot of the civic leaders, stakeholders around there, a nonprofit group in Cleveland called Land Studio, which stands for Landscape, Architecture, Neighborhood, and Development. Had been a long-time public space advocacy. They took this on to kind of work with this new group plan. We worked with them to develop these programs and for these edges. You see here with the lawn kind of grayed out, the middle portion of the mall, the kind of trying to develop these active edges. What's interesting here now is one of the questions to look at today for me is like, who is the civic? Who's the group that starts to decide this? They no longer have Daniel Burnham saying, I think this is civic. We now have a wide group of stakeholders doing it, and what Land Studio ended up doing was we developed different program options because there's always this competition between planting and program, and we are trying to say that planting is a program. It's not just the thing that frames the program. So we developed several options. They put these online, and there was an online survey. If you lived in Cleveland, you could go in and vote on which combination of program or planting or playground or tennis court or garden that you liked. So we're still waiting to see what the results of that are. That's ongoing. The Lurie Garden is a project that GGN did before I joined them. It was their first project they won in a competition. It's in Millennium Park, which is in Grant Park, which is part of, once again, Burnham's plan for Chicago. It's on the lakefront. You see it here. It's in the kind of lower right-hand corner there. You see Frank Gehry's band shell, and it's just to the right of that. The site for this, not that atypical today, was originally it was built on top of a parking deck, which was built on top of former rail yards, which way back before that had been an old shoreline and then filled land. They'd filled the land out as they moved the shoreline out. The little red square shows you where our site was. There was half of our site that was true land, and the other half was filled land. On this project, in the competition, when GGN got this, they were about 6 people. They looked at the list of other people and they said, let's just go back a little bit. They looked at a list of other people. Piet Oldhoff, the plantsman from the Netherlands, was one of the other people that was invited. GGN called him up and said, maybe we should team together. He said, that'd be great, I'd love to do that. So it was a collaborative effort with GGN and Piet Oldhoff Piet Oldhoff did all the perennial plantings for this. The plantings of this, as this changes through the seasons there, we'll go through that one more time. That went really fast. Okay. It goes through there. Started out, the concept that we had was it was going to be all native. Working with Pete, it was a mixture of native and non-native. But we really started to do a couple things on that. What we tried to do from the design of what was important was try to deal with the vertical wall of the city and then the great plain of the lake looking out there. This model, which is kind of a model that GGN would frequently do, shows you sort of the shape of the garden. You sort of see the big kind of L shape in the upper corner on the left-hand side, that kind of big hedge that started to frame it in. You also start to see the movement of the land. GGN's work early on was known for a lot of land movement, but this is where they actually had the land movement. They started to try to unify that with the planting as well. The feeling here, the concept was that you wanted to be not just a green roof that you walked on. A lot of the rest of Millennium Park was like that, but to really be in the plants. The plants became the experience, and you walk through them. As you can see in the model here, the land is tilted up and the paths are cut through, so you really felt like you were walking through the plants. The plants obviously had different heights. It's subtle topography, but it really works well, frames you in, it encloses you. This was supposed to be obviously a kind of a botanical garden. The other programmatic thing, it also had to have 10,000 people exit through it when they left Frank Gehry's band shell at the end of the show. So the challenge here of how you be small and intimate and also exit 10,000 people through occasionally. A couple of shots here looking at what that means. We really wanted the planting here, as we said, to be really that experience, to really be pushing up and full, to really be different from the rest of the park. This is the boardwalk running through with the water feature. This boardwalk matches where the dividing line between the fill land and the true land, and it also became a division in the planting between kind of a drier, sunny side on the high ground and a shadier, wet side on the other side of this water feature here. But you can see here the way the walls and the topography, you can see the people in the distance with their heads sticking up just above the planting. And just some other scenes, you've got the big wall of the city, and how do we frame that in? These are early shots. In the distance, you see the framework of the hedge, what's called the shoulder hedge, which hasn't really filled in yet. It has now. This project opened in 2004. The Salvia River here was something that was laid out in conjunction with Pete Oldhoff and GGN. Pete had done this in Europe, but he hadn't done one in the US before. And it's a seasonal event. There again, where the planting becomes the real thing to do. And just some more shots of people walking through the park and with the city behind it. So the planting being the experience. Here in this last project I'll talk about, Centennial Park Master Plan in Nashville. This was the 1897 Tennessee Centennial Exposition, as the client, which was the Conservancy for the Parthenon, told us. It was actually 1 year late. They started planning it and they couldn't get it together, so it was actually the 101st year instead of the 100th year. But they said, you'll get to know us, that's kind of the way we are. So in 1897, now this plan, that Chicago World's Fair Exposition came out in 1893, so this is directly coming out of that kind of fever for having a world exposition. And at this point, Nashville was a pretty far western destination for the US, and it has always been known as the Athens of the South, and it still to this day has a full-scale Parthenon, which one of the supporters told us early on it was better than the original. In this plan, there were a lot of temporary buildings. Eventually, you'll see in shots, the Parthenon was kept, and it really became the grounds for a park with the Parthenon at its center. As it developed as a park, it's always had, programming has not been its issue. It's always had programming, still to this day. They have big band dances on this night, they have art shows. It's always been Nashville's cultural arts and education park. It's also become a repository for any kind of memorials or markers or anything like that. Some site-specific, some that they just thought maybe it'd be nice to put these in the park, and some, honestly, I think they didn't know where they should go and they just stuck them in there. But, Nashville is very fond of this park. If this park had any problem, it was being loved to death. There was a lot of competing program, and over the time, as you can see here with the Parthenon in the middle, the lake there, there was a lot of competing program. There was so roads were starting to encroach upon it. The edges were getting chewed away. Parking was sort of showing up in odd places where it was close to a particular event or something. So in looking at the master plan, we said we need to try to figure out what we can do to accommodate all these programs, but not screw up the park, which is the other thing they told us. So this was our master plan from 2010. One of the things we did, we found in the park, beneath a grate on a walk around early on, we found an old a spring that had been a historic spring that had been probably at the end of the Natchez Trace right before you turned and went into Nashville. It was currently still there being a spring underground. You see it through the gate. It was being pumped to the sewage, being pumped across town to the sewage to be cleaned, although it was not dirty. So what we did, we proposed, why don't we take that? Why don't we restore some of the lakes that were originally in this exposition by using the spring that probably did it anyway in the beginning? So the plan was to take that, pump the water around, and make the park, from a sustainable aspect, be a much bigger, greener engine. It would take up the stormwater from the park. It would take runoff from the other neighborhoods around it. It would also use this the spring water then that was coming through and store it under the big lawn there, and not use potable water then for the lakes or for irrigation. You can see the other thing we started to do in here is you'll start to see a series of scales and things, introducing other things into the park. And I think about is what we tried to do is restore complexity to the park, but at the same time, restore some clarity. And the way we started, because I said there are a lot of programs, they're all kind of running into each other physically and in time and scheduling. And the park had gotten smaller over time. We pulled the park back out to its edges, and we said, let's get this complexity and let's get this clarity back in there. The way we're going to do that, we looked at this, as I said, there are a lot of memorials and markers in it. The park has a history of kind of a picturesque tradition and some classical elements in it. So we developed this thing to work with, developed a set of principles we called contemporary picturesque, which was a mixture of sort of the historic principles of picturesque and then some ideas about modern sustainability and putting those together. Developed these principles about landscape as theater, amplification effect, illusion and wonder. And all these were being done primarily. We had program, we were doing this with planting and different kinds of planting. Some of it was sustainable planting and some of it was ornamental planting. But try to get these different ideas in there. We introduced the ideas. There had been a tradition of horticulture education, rose arbors, other kinds of arbors. We talked about putting in food gardens and bringing in some of this other kind of planting in there. On the sustainable side, we talked about innovation. They wanted this park to be a teaching park as a role model for other parks in the region. Restoration, preservation of buildings and landscape. Nature's program was very big too, to get nature back there as an equal program element. A functional landscape so it could do things, it could clean things. Community, it had a diverse community, 2 universities on either side, a big community. It's a community park for the people in Nashville, but also within a regional area. And flexibility, because of all these competing programs, what can we use the spaces for so they can work for different operations? Okay, now in my concluding thoughts on that then, I don't know what the answer is to all this stuff. And in looking at all these projects coming out of the City Beautiful, looking at what they mean today, I thought for us in civic horticulture, one of the questions I keep coming back to is, what does civic mean today? I mean, we had very different client groups on this. Is civic the people who vote online for what they want? Is it the private conservancy that comes in and says, we think this is a really good idea? Or how do these things get, who gets to decide? We don't have Burnham telling us anymore what to do. Looking at this too, when can horticulture then be civic again and create spaces in the city? Because it seems like there was a tradition of doing that, and can it be at that big scale then? Can nature be the program? And so we're not left with just filling in or just doing the interstitial residual spaces that are left over by, say, other people's bad planning projects. Can we really take horticulture and use it as a tool to really create spaces in the city? And again, I think on the last one there, can horticulture be more than just a pragmatic sustainability? Can it be more than just a green roof, that kind of flat green roof, which more and more is becoming the answer? It ticks off a lot of boxes. It's very successful, but it seems to miss a lot of the earlier potential of what horticulture could do.